Good afternoon, everybody. It's always a pleasure to see the room fill up so fast, or the Zoom room fill up so fast, as it were. Um, my name's Jim Farney. I'm the Regina Director here at JSGS. I've got some introductory comments and kind of scene setting before we get to our guest speaker today, Dr. Alasdair Roberts. Um, so I'll walk through those and then we'll do it. But the broad outline of what we'll do today is that Alasdair will walk us through kind of a half-hour presentation on his book, The Adaptable Country, How Canada Can Survive the 21st Century. We'll have a Q&A after that to kind of fill in what I hope will be an hour and a half of very interesting discussion on a day when I'm sure many of us are at the very least a little bit sleepy. So that's kind of my hope over this lunch hour. You're joining a JSGS talk, of course, and we're proud to be a hub for advanced study and discussion about public policy and public administration here in Saskatchewan. We are a partnership between the University of Regina and the University of Saskatchewan with, I always like to say, the silent partnership of the Saskatchewan Public Service as a triad there. I'm joining from Treaty 4 here in Regina, so the traditional homeland of the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Saulteaux, Lakota, Dakota, and the traditional homeland of the Métis. The school also operates on Treaty 6 in Saskatoon physically, and I know since we're online, people are joining from all sorts of both treaty and non-treaty unceded territory. I like to say that out of all of Canada's public policy schools, JSGS is in the best situation to give some flesh to that acknowledgement by partnering closely with communities, and I hope we do live up to the ambition in those words. It's important, maybe the important thing in Canadian governance. So. This is a talk we had not originally planned for today. The timing is fortuitous, but my forecasting skills are not so big. Dr. Roberts has had a really remarkable run of publication over the last 5 years, and I'd originally talked to him about coming to talk about a book called Strategies for Governing that I think was a really pretty broad take on how we need to rethink how we study and think about the state. As things unfolded, it made more sense to talk about his Canadian-focused book, just out from McGill Queen's University Press, The Adaptable Country, How Canada Can Survive the 21st Century. And I know from LinkedIn and other socials that he's on quite the speaking tour about it. It's that combination of serious thinking about how we should think about the state and in the case of this book, kind of more hands-on-y piece that I think will make a fascinating combination. But also, and there's not many folks like this, the coterie of people who study Canada seriously in the United States is very small, and they tend to be, Canadian citizens who've somehow found their way there. So he's coming to us as a very, very significant scholar of public administration. In 2007, he was the first non-American elected to the U.S. Academy of Public Admin. In 2014, he received Canada's Grace Pepin Award for his research on open governance. And in 2022, the American Political Science Association Lifetime Achievement Award for studies in comparative public administration. His JD is from the University of Toronto. His PhD is from Harvard. He's a very serious political historian as well as a comparative scholar, and I hope some of that mix of looking sideways and backwards in time can come out in the questions today. So that is my best effort at an introduction and a welcome, and I'm very glad to turn it over to Alasdair and hear what he has to say today.
Well, thanks, Jim. It's great to be here virtually today. Thank you so much to the school for the invitation, and thanks everybody for taking time out of your day to have a conversation. It just occurred to me I should probably show I do have my Tim Hortons mug here, just Canadian content. So what I'm going to do is talk a bit about this book, The Adaptable Country, and I'll get the PowerPoint fired up in just a second. I've also written about American politics. I did a book a couple of years ago called Four Crises of American Democracy. So when we get to the Q&A, if we want to talk about the challenges of American governance, I'd be glad to do that. That book was also, there's also a sort of a thread that connects that book, this book, the Strategies for Governing book that Jim mentioned. And it's basically all about the way in which countries address new challenges, the extent to which they get ahead of the curve, the way in which countries reorient their thinking about what national priorities should be. So it's all of a piece. So let me just share the PowerPoint and get rolling. And I am going to, um, in case you're, so Jim, can you just give me a thumbs up? Does that look okay? Okay, good. So just so you know, the running time for this movie is about 25 minutes, and then we can open it up for conversation. So the book I'm going to be talking about is called The Adaptable Country: How Canada Can Survive the 21st Century, and it is out from McGill Queen's Press just a few weeks ago. Um, I went to bed about 10 o'clock last night because I had a feeling I knew which way that the story was unfolding, and I also knew I was going to wake up at 3 in the morning anyway. So I woke up at 3 and found out that I found Trump speaking on the TV, and I sort of knew what the story was. As it happens, as I was looking at Twitter or X at 3 in the morning, I noticed that somebody had posted this tweet: "Canada right now, I'm in danger." Coming from the National Meme Board. I actually wasn't familiar with this federal agency, but I'm glad to know it exists. But this is all of a piece. This is sort of the theme for the day. What I'm going to talk to you about is this sort of argument in the book, but what I want to start off by doing is just flagging for premises or assumptions that kind of undergird a lot of my writing and this book in particular. The first premise is we live in a dangerous world, and your reaction might be to say, well, obviously. But I think it's worth noting that 25 years ago, around about 1999 or 2000, it would have been an eccentric view to say we live in a dangerous world. There were a lot of folks who were basically saying we'd sort of reached the sunny uplands of governance, that we'd reached this durable plateau of peace and prosperity, that even that we'd reached the end of history. I mean, clearly one thing we've realized is that history has come roaring back. And I think Canada in particular can expect that coming decades, perhaps even the balance of this century, is going to be a turbulent era, turbulent and uncertain. And I can give you a short list. I won't belabor these points because they'll be familiar to you. The effects of the climate emergency, the direct effects of climate change on Canada itself, the knock-on effects because of the way in which climate change affects other countries, for example, the rise in unauthorized migration, or the changing behavior of other governments as they begin to appreciate that Canada is laying claim to a very large share of the world's fresh water and habitable land and mineral resources. Shifting geopolitics, the rise of new powers like India and China. I would argue that we're going to see increased and persistent instability within all the major powers. I mean, that's not going to be a surprise when I say that with regard to the United States. Regardless of who would have won last night, I would have said we're going to be looking at prolonged instability in the U.S. But I also think we're going to be looking at prolonged challenges of stability maintenance in countries like India, China, and the European and polities like the European Union as well. Obviously, the effects of technological shock on the economy, on civil discourse, on warfare too, as new weaponry is rolled out and governments make calculations about how that weaponry might be used. And then, of course, there's a bundle of internal pressures that will be familiar to Canadians as well, including chronic distrust of public officials and regional pressures. So premise one, we're living in a dangerous world and we will be for quite some time. Premise two, cheerful note to start the day, but political systems die. That's the lesson of history. Humanity has been building large-scale polities for about 3,000 or 4,000 years. And one thing we've learned from all of these experiments in large-scale governance is that eventually systems collapse. And the aim of the game in governance, if you've got a good thing going, is to keep it going as long as you can. even today, we can't take stability or durability for granted. There are about 190 countries in the world today. Most of them are relatively young. Most countries in the world are younger than I am. Most people on the planet live in countries that are ranked as either very fragile or extremely fragile. So fragility really is the norm in terms of governance. And we've also seen, stable states that can tip into fragility fairly quickly. The Soviet Union was graded as a stable state in 1985, and of course it was off the map only a few years later. Premise number 3, how do systems collapse? There's no one magic explanation. The previous slide I showed you, that sort of list of challenges that are going to face Canada in the coming century, also happens to be sort of a laundry list of challenges that have contributed to the collapse of political systems throughout history. It's never one thing. It's usually a system, a leadership group that gets hit by one crisis and then gets hit by another crisis. Crises interact and compound. They make the system vulnerable to additional crises. And so you run into this potential cascade of crises that eventually overwhelm leaders. That would be my sort of general take on why systems collapse. So there's a very strong argument for getting ahead of the curve, for avoiding a rise of crises, and of course, avoiding polycrisis in particular. So that's premise 3. Premise 4 is that adaptability is the critical quality for modern states. Adaptability, I mean by that the capacity of countries to get ahead of the curve, their capacity to anticipate problems and reinvent their grand strategy, their national strategy, to address new challenges, new circumstances. And I would argue that basically adaptability, an adaptable system, is one that can perform 4 functions. The system is capable of looking forward to anticipate long-term dangers, so it's not blindsided. It's clever at inventing strategies for managing the complete set of dangers that are likely to face the country. It's good at building political support for one path or another, and that's going to be support within the leadership group and also within the general population. And it's good at taking new ideas, new broad policies, and converting them into action by renovating institutions, building new ones, demolishing old ones, and so on. So those are the 4 features, I would argue, of an adaptable system. The argument I make in this book is that adaptability in Canada has declined over the last 40 years in a variety of ways. Our capacity to look down the road and think creatively about strategy, and our ability to build agreement about strategy and to translate plans into action. And I'm going to make the argument that this is partly the result of social and economic transformations, just the way the country has changed. The country's changed in many good ways, and we should be glad about that. But one side effect is that it may have compromised adaptability. I'll explain why I say that in a moment. But the other reason adaptability has declined is because of choices, deliberate choices made by governments about tearing down institutions that actually served useful purposes and building up new institutions that tend to reinforce or undermine adaptability. So it's conscious choices we've made as well. And of course, the warning is that if a system doesn't maintain a relatively high level of adaptability in a turbulent, dangerous environment, you're looking at a higher risk of system failure. So that's the argument. It's occurred to me as I've been talking about the book, I could do a word swap here that might be and might help to bring the argument home. I've been sort of thinking rather abstractly about adaptability and system survival. This is also a story about political sovereignty. And by that, I mean the capacity of Canadians as a political community to exercise effective control over their country's future, so far as you can in difficult circumstances. That's what sovereignty is about, really, that whether you can chart your own course. And when I talk about the erosion of adaptability, that ability to see down the road and go in the direction you'd like to go in, I'm really talking about effective sovereignty, political sovereignty. There are some politicians today who talk about the need for Canadians to take back control. Well, I would argue that restoring adaptability really is about Canadians taking back control in the sense that they are exercising a meaningful degree of influence over the way the country evolves in coming decades. So let me tell you, oh yeah, I should say just, by way, the much larger picture here, which interests me as well, relevant for the United States as well as Canada. I argue in a previous book that I think this century really is going to be sort of a road test of alternate ways of governing. You've got on the one hand, various forms of democratic government um, and various forms of authoritarianism. By democracy, I mean liberal democratic systems in the Canadian context, federal systems as well, ones that are market oriented. There's a lot of virtues to running open polities like this, but there are also complaints about systems like this, the tendency toward short-sightedness, preoccupation with the demands of the moment, the inability to get people on the same page, the inability to get people to act together in a coordinated way. These are sort of familiar complaints about diffuse open societies. And there are a lot of critics, especially advocates of the Chinese approach, the Chinese approach of technocratic authoritarianism, who basically say systems that are set up this way will not succeed in navigating the turbulent waters of the coming decades. And I think our challenge in Canada, in the United States, in other democratic systems is to prove the skeptics wrong, that it is possible for societies built on the principle of openness, of respect for human rights and diversity. It is possible to construct systems like that are also adroit in navigating through turbulent waters. So that's the big thing I have in mind. So let me just talk a bit about the Canadian case. I'm going to basically say a bit about the background, and then I'm going to run 4 particular arguments past you. Um, One reason adaptability is more challenging than it used to be is just that the country is bigger and more complex. We've got 50% more people in Canada than there were in the early 1980s. From the point of view of 1980, that's like adding another Ontario and another Quebec to Confederation. So the simple increase in population makes getting everybody on the same page more challenging. The economy, by the way, is similarly increased in scale and complexity. Individual Canadians uh, have better entrenched individual rights, and people are more attentive to their rights. People are generally much better educated than they were, let's say, in the 1970s. So they're more rights conscious. That sphere of individual autonomy is bigger than it used to be. Power, I think, has shifted from the federal government to provincial governments. We're taking the necessary first steps toward recognizing the principle of self-governance by Indigenous communities. Over the last 40 years, we've shifted power from the government to the marketplace. Governments are not heavily into running state-owned enterprises, for example. We don't regulate as heavily as we used to. We've integrated the Canadian economy into a liberalized global economy. All of that involves a shift of power from government to the marketplace. And then finally, we've seen obviously technology shock and the way in which Canadian social networks have been restructured. And in particular, Canadian social networks, the social networks that individual Canadians participate in, now involve many more connections to individuals outside the country or institutions outside the country, with the result that news and information and ideas travels much more quickly into the country from overseas. And I would note, and I'll come back to this in particular, the heavy influence of American social networks on Canadian networks. So the basic idea here, as I said a moment ago, that federal liberal democratic systems, open systems, have these sort of inherent vulnerabilities. Our version of that system has become larger, more complex, more dynamic over the last 40 years, all to the good, but it has aggravated those potential vulnerabilities of confusion and miscoordination. An individual who sort of knows that's going to happen might say, well, we need to do some kind of compensating activity. Gilles Paquette, a Canadian scholar, wrote about 30 years ago about the problem of maintaining the ligatures of Canadian society, by which he meant the connective tissue that holds everything together. I think the argument I would make is that we haven't done a sufficiently good job of making sure that the connective tissue remains healthy, with the result that the risks of confusion or miscoordination are higher than they used to be. So I'm going to run 4 arguments briefly past you. These are the sort of 4 big arguments I make in the book. Democratic systems are always prone to short-term tendencies. That is, politicians govern with an eye on the next election. I'm going to argue that the tendency toward myopia or short-termism has increased. I think that's partly because of increased electoral instability. Voters don't have the party loyalties that they used to. You can see the rise and fall of party fortunes is much more dramatic than it used to be. Governments are not so secure about their tenure as they used to be. So all of that results in a stronger fixation on the next election. Political parties have been professionalized, and they're much better at sort of doing the necessary to win votes to gain seats in the next election. We've also seen a shift to what I call in the book platform governance, a sort of mentality about politics and governance that puts heavy emphasis on the party platform. This expectation that parties are going to run with a detailed, fully costed platform, a bundle of detailed promises made to different constituencies, and the notion that governing involves the fulfilling these provinces within one mandate, one electoral cycle. We didn't always think about politics this way. There are several particular difficulties with this sort of model of platform governance. But one observation I would make is this. When you move to a world in which the platform, that bundle of promises, is especially important, you're putting a lot of weight on the capacity of political parties to shape thoughtful platforms. And one of the deficiencies, I think, of Canadian political parties is that they lack the policy capacity necessary to do that well. Once governments get into office, very often you've got rookie ministers who are new to the job. And all the stories we hear from serving politicians is about the extraordinary pressure of day-to-day politics, about how they can easily be overwhelmed or stressed out by the flow of events. One of the effects of the digital revolution is that the decision makers are bombarded with information and demands much more intensively than they once were. And the complaint is that people don't have space to think. So, all of this conduces to sort of a tendency towards short-termism or reactive politics. One way you fix that is by having counterbalancing institutions. If you know you've got bad habits, you create institutions that sort of check those bad habits. We used to have counterbalancing institutions that performed that sort of function, but one of the things we did over the last 40 years was sort of deinstitutionalize them. We stopped relying on them. We used to use large-scale royal commissions to take a moment, take a breath, and think about the future in a sustained way. Classic example might be the Macdonald Commission of the 1980s on Canada's prospects. Royal commissions of that sort have gone out of fashion. We used to have independent advisory councils like the Economic Council and the Science Council that did much the same thing. We abandoned councils like that in the 1990s, ostensibly on austerity grounds. And so, one of our difficulties is we've got increased tendencies towards short-termism, and we have also at the same time removed these sort of counterbalancing institutions. So that's problem 1. Problem 2, I said that, adaptability means the capacity to build political agreement among Canadians about the path forward. And that's agreement at 2 levels. It's agreement among leaders within the sort of leadership group, and agreement among the general public. With regard to the leadership group, Canada used to have an institution that was considered to be sort of a mainstay of Canadian governance. If you read a text on Canadian government in the 60s, 70s, 80s, it would have been sort of routine to say, well, First Ministers' conferences are sort of an essential element of of Canadian governance. The practice of having annual robust FMCs was institutionalized. But that practice has actually been deinstitutionalized over the last 30 years, by which I mean we've sort of abandoned the practice of regular First Ministers' conferences. Kind of perversely, just as the federal government was abandoning the routine of regular meetings with premiers, the practice of summitry was getting institutionalized in other contexts. And I'll just give you one example. Canada spends hundreds of millions of dollars to host meetings now and then of G7 leaders. And the argument that is made by the Canadian government is, well, we may not get deals done at these meetings, but we establish personal connections, we create personal bonds that are essential in moments of stress, we develop shared understandings, we try to shape an understanding about a shared agenda in the years coming forward. And the point I would make is that exactly the same logic could be used and should be used to restore the practice of annual First Ministers' conferences within Canada as well. So that's a problem 2. Now, problem 3 is what I call the decaying public sphere. I'm a little ambivalent about calling it this. This is a phrase from Habermas, just a little more abstruse than I like to be. But I mean by this that sort of shared space in which Canadians are able to talk to one another about national concerns. Why does this matter? Because this is partly the forum in which we invent new ideas about how to move the country forward. And especially critically, it's the forum in which we build political agreement, general political agreement about where we're trying to go. A public sphere, especially in Canada, is not a natural phenomenon. It has to be constructed and maintained. A big part of the project of 20th century Canada was trying to figure out how to build and maintain a public sphere in a context in which there were constantly new information technologies coming along and sort of upending the status quo. I basically argue that a healthy public sphere has 4 characteristics. That is, it's got a stable agenda, by which I mean all of us can sort of know what it is we're going to be talking about from one month to the next. It's got an agenda that's set by Canadians rather than by foreigners and reflects Canadian concerns. And it's a forum in which we're having civil and informed conversation. We know what we're talking about, and we're treating each other with respect. One of the difficulties, I think, today is that the Canadian public sphere has been upended. It's been clearly upended by digital shocks, the advent of new media like social media and the decline of so-called legacy or old media. And we've seen several things happen. The agenda has been destabilized in the sense that it's never entirely clear what's going to be the hot topic from one moment to the next. The agenda has been to some degree denationalized in the sense that Canadian politics in some respects becomes an echo effect of American politics in particular. We've seen a coarsening of civil discourse, and of course other countries have seen that as well. And in the Canadian context, there's sort of ongoing chronic concerns about low levels of civic and historical knowledge. That is, do Canadians understand how their political system works and, for example, how it differs from the American system? Do they have enough understanding of their own history, the challenges the country's gone through in the past? So a bundle of reasons to be concerned about the public sphere. Throughout the 20th century, Canadian governments were sort of routinely doing health checks on the public sphere and thinking about what they needed to do to, by way of government policy to keep it going in a healthy way. And I think I would argue that that practice has fallen by the wayside over the last 20 years, that we're not addressing this challenge as directly as we might, and the policies that do pertain to it tend to be slow, and fragmented and sometimes ineffective. So that's problem 3, and I'll just touch on the last problem and then I'll just move to wrap up. So I said, adaptability requires inventing a new strategy, reaching some agreement about it, and then translating it into action. Um, Translating into action very often involves the role of federal and provincial bureaucracies. In this book, I look specifically at the federal bureaucracy. There are a fair number of concerns about the condition of the federal bureaucracy and its capacity to move nimbly, a sense that there's a certain sort of sclerosis or a risk aversion settling within the federal public service. And sort of my take on this story would be this, that risk aversion or sclerosis are the symptoms. The underlying problem or challenge in the Canadian public service is the accretion of rules over 50 or 60 years. And very often these rules are adopted with the best of intentions. Sometimes it's because we want the federal government to act like a model employer or to reflect or take seriously core values like respect for official languages or respect for privacy or respect for employment equity and so on. And sometimes it's because we're concerned about probity or accountability in federal government. You know, we want to avoid waste, fraud, and abuse. We want open government. So we adopt rules about how money should be used or how people should be used or how information should be handled and disseminated. In the Canadian context, we've layered on rules over the span of decades. Very often we've established watchdogs, parliamentary officers, independent bodies to monitor those rules. I think Canada has probably had a particular enthusiasm for establishing these watchdogs, perhaps more than many other countries. But we've also created a certain kind of political dynamic as a result of all this. We establish a rule, more rules. That means there's more potential for rule violations. We've got watchdogs who are on the lookout for rule violations. They publish reports about one rule violation or another. Opposition politicians and interest groups, perhaps seeking to criticize the government, pick up on these reports. Journalists looking for ready-made stories pick up on the reports. News about rule violations seeps into popular conversation, perhaps aggravating the sense that, wow, there must be a lot of rule violations in federal government, which of course reinforces the argument for more rules. Added to that dynamic, you've got the reality of the intensification of political control over the federal public service over the last 40 years. The emergence, the growth in number of political staff, the emergence of what I will call is effectively a new political service. There are almost as many people working as political staffers in Ottawa as work in the Department of Finance. And their behavior, their interaction with the federal bureaucracy, I think, you know, sometimes can be justified, but sometimes has unintended effects, including a sort of skittishness in the public service itself. The main argument I would make here is that very often these various kinds of controls are established with the best of intentions, not always with a careful benefit cost analysis. But certainly what has not happened is a look at the cumulative effect, the tangible and intangible costs of layering controls over decades. It used to be that we would have the practice periodically of setting up a true independent review of the condition of the federal public service. But this is another instance in which we made a deliberate choice. We haven't had a real independent review of the federal public service in decades. One might even argue in more than half a century. So we've got a serious problem of deferred maintenance with regard to the federal public service. So I won't belabor the point too much longer. You know, for one reason or another, I think adaptability is on the decline. I've got a series of ideas about what we might do to restore or improve adaptability, like having some kind of digital era McDonald Commission or increasing the cranial capacity of political parties by creating party political foundations on the European model, reviving robust First Ministers' conferences, developing a more coherent approach to maintaining the health of the public sphere, having an independent review, not just of the federal bureaucracy, but also the federal political service, a bundle of ways in which we can sort of improve the system without constitutional reform, for example, to improve adaptability. And I'll just close on this final point. This is just an excerpt from an op-ed that I had in the Montreal Gazette last week. If you'd like to see the full op-ed, you can go to my website, which is alasdairroberts.ca, and you can read it. But this is just sort of in the last part of the op-ed. It was talking about the tenor of Canadian politics, and I made the observation that, especially as we move into an election period, we're going to be paying more attention to politics. Sometimes it's going to be very personal and nasty. Sometimes it's going to be reactive, fixated on problems we could have anticipated but didn't. And sometimes, even when it's forward-looking, it's going to be focused on this sort of platform governance. What promises are being made that can be executed within the next 3 or 4 years? So even when it's looking down the road, it tends toward short-termism. And the point I would make is that this kind of politics isn't inevitable. To a large degree, we get this kind of politics because that's the way we set up the machinery of politics. We've designed the system to generate this kind of outcomes. So when you look at political conversation as we move into an election period and you get frustrated by it, I think it's important to recognize that there's a different way to engage in politics in this country. And I will just pause there and I'll stop sharing as well. Right. Thank you, Jim. And you're muted, Jim, I think.
I am still muted. There we go. You think I would have learned to use Zoom by now. So I've already got questions coming in, and I will start tap dancing through them momentarily, but I do want to take the privilege of moderator to ask one that, since I want to be a good host, I'm going to try and phrase a challenge as nerdily as possible. There's a lot of ways to think about complex systems, which I think is what you're doing here. One of my favorite debates in the social sciences is a debate that happens between two economists, Keynes and Hayek, in the 1930s. Keynes's position is we can know enough about the economy in real time to do counter-cyclical planning. Turns out he was broadly right about the knowledge piece. Hayek's was that we can't, that there's knowledge is so decentralized that we won't be able to learn enough in real time to make decisions, and so we ought to just decentralize things. I've got to say, whether you think about decentralizing power to provinces or the growth of First Nations and municipalities, the outsourcing of policy to the market under Chrétien and Martin and Harper, or to community-based organizations under the current federal government, we are operating in an incredibly diffuse political system. And I do wonder about the notion of having a singular strategy when we've diffused legitimacy and knowledge so much in public policy making. Like, is it possible to pull it back together in the way that we had in the 1960s Royal Commissions? Or should we be embracing this decentralization of legitimacy and information in kind of a new way?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And you'll notice that I've avoided entirely the rhetoric of central planning. We do operate a highly decentralized polity. Perhaps one of the most decentralized polities in the world, and we do that for good reasons, because we want to respect, individual freedom and diversity and the right of self-determination. So we don't want to upend the principle of decentralization. But I think Gilles Paquette had it right years ago when he said, we need to figure out how do we knit the system together? Presumably we want to preserve the system. One argument would be, look, Canada it's got many moving parts. There are going to be very strong centrifugal pressures in it. The thing might just blow apart. It might just come apart naturally. It just might unwind naturally. Perhaps perhaps we're not troubled by that. If you would like to say, no, there's something to the enterprise as a whole that we would like to preserve, then you've got to think about the question of how you do overcome these potential difficulties of miscommunication, confusion, miscoordination. And you're right. I might have the solutions wrong. I do say in the preface to the book, um, probably not an inspiring way to start the book, but I do say in the preface, I could be wrong about a lot of this. But I said let's separate the layers of wrongness. Um, you know, um, I might be wrong about the specific prescriptions, although I don't think I'm wrong. About the merits of doing another digital era royal commission or about restoring an FMC. I'm actually pretty sure I'm right about that. But let's assume that I got the solutions wrong. The one thing I would encourage people to do is step back and say, okay, given the character of the system, the decentralized character of the system, what are the ways in which we can sort of encourage some degree of coordination and deliberation about the future? How do we adjust the way we work so that we're stretching our temporal horizons, 10 or 20 or 30 years into the future?
I'm going to riff a little bit on Dami's question here. Thinking maybe specifically about the public service, are there any kind of incremental ways we could imagine shifting how people work together in this decentralized way? Short of a royal commission or a full review, uh, is there room for incremental improvement?
Yeah, so there's two aspects I'm going to flag here. One is the general question of sclerosis in the federal public service. The question of risk aversion, the web of rules as I described it. Um, there are people. There's a back and forth about whether there needs to be an independent inquiry on the kind of overall condition of the public service. There are some people who say, no, we can do this internally. The clerk can set up some sort of task force to sort of think about how we act more nimbly. I take the view that that's not going to do the job, um, uh, because there's certain things that an internal inquiry can't adequately address, can't address statutory controls in the public service really that effectively, can't address the role of political staff in the public service over the public service that effectively. Um, I think in that instance, we just need to bite the bullet and recognize we've got a real problem of deferred maintenance here, and take a serious look at how you create a public service that's going to be sufficiently flexible and perform well for the next 30 years. That's one thing. The second thing is, the role of the public service in this sort of general question of forward thinking. And I don't want to, I've sort of shortchanged the fact that there are within departments entities that are looking down the road, and I want to acknowledge that. There are departments that are trying to develop long-term strategies, but again, there's limits to what can be done there. Because for me, I'm thinking about grand strategy. I'm thinking about our collective understanding about what this country is trying to accomplish over the next 20 or 30 years. And that needs to be a conversation that happens at a political level and in the public arena. And there's limits to what offices within the federal bureaucracy can properly do in that respect too.
Thank you. So Raquel poses, I think, an interesting question. You talk about some in the book about kind of you mentioned it in the presentation, the power of political staff and kind of the parallel concentration of power around the prime minister and the PMO. This is an old story. I'm convinced it goes back as far as Chrétien, but you could make an argument that Trudeau the first was a victim to it too, and it's certainly true of premiers. Are there structural reasons why grand strategy does not come from those centralized pieces of our policymaking apparatus?
Yeah, I think the I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this. The sort of standard argument was the PMO is far too powerful. The system's been excessively centralized in the hands of the PMO. I'm fairly sure that if we talk to anybody in the PMO or the Prime Minister himself, he would say, you have no idea how crazy it is on a day-to-day basis. All we're trying to do is hold things together in an incredibly fast-paced world. And if it is the case that we're kind of holding the reins tightly at the center, it's because we are trying to avoid the whole thing kind of coming apart. If you want a version of this story, by the way, look at Tony Blair's recent book, which is sort of makes the same argument. And so that's in a story in which they say, if you want to talk about effective control, the PMO doesn't have it because we're overwhelmed by events. That if that were right, and I think there's something to that argument, they don't have space, they don't have time to think about grand strategy as well. They're dealing with the sort of day to day. And I think there's a bit of a paradox too, and I'm going to take this argument for a test drive. What's the argument? The language is sort of message discipline. The center needs to be in control of messaging because in an increasingly complex and chaotic information environment, the center needs to sort of control the day-to-day messaging so that it can try and shape the agenda. It's just trying to keep things together. And, in particular, one reason we're not enthused about the idea of independent councils, or God help us, an independent royal commission, is we don't know what they're going to say. And I think I would argue that there's a sort of counterintuitive argument that if you want to shape the agenda in today's information environment, you have to sort of loosen control to gain control. Trying to control the agenda just by tightening control over day-to-day communications is not going to work. There's too many signals out there. You won't be able to break through the noise. The way you break through the noise is by doing sustained, heavy investment in sort of anchoring institutions that will shape public debate over the long run. And that's what, for example, a royal commission would do. That's what a robust system of first ministers conferences would do if appropriately designed. It sort of they exercise a sort of gravitational force on the public dialogue. And so if the prime minister really wants to get control over the long-term debate, paradoxically, you sort of have to give up control in the short run.
I'm curious if I could kind of follow on a little bit there. One of the points you've made in other places is that we should look outside the Atlantic world for examples of good public administration. And I think it's hard to make the case that the US or the UK or Canada or France are doing grand strategy well right now. Are there global examples of nation states that are managing to pull this off?
Well, I think, and I think just to be clear, we're never going to reach. I am not arguing for central planning. So I'm not arguing we're going to get together and we're going to have a 40-page document that spells out what we're going to do. What I am talking about is something a little more diffuse, but a sort of shared understanding about how we're managing challenges down the road. At minimum, a shared understanding about what the challenges are, so that we're not surprised when something comes up. And we have a reasonable understanding of what our options are. And we're making decisions that reflect our understanding about the hard realities that are out there. That's what I'm thinking about with grand strategy. I don't think, given the usual suspects, I am hard pressed to think of polities that are doing it, democratic systems that are doing it well. The countries that are usually trotted out as examples, Norway, Sweden, so on, the usual suspects. Denmark, I would point out, are relatively small, territorially compact, relatively homogeneous unitary states. And so, I think Canada's in a different position. The contrary argument is the argument that comes from China, which is an argument for sort of technocratic authoritarianism. You know, what you need is technocrats at the center who are sort of thinking about this, and carefully regulated public consultation, and severe control on the boundaries of conversation, and centrally led investment in capacity and so on. That's not the road we want to go on. But if we don't want to go down that path, the question is, how do you ensure a future orientation and coherence in a diffused open polity?
Trying to think of examples, because it's I think just worthwhile. I mean, there are some provincial examples. So Quebec, I think you could argue, has pursued a grand strategy in the last decade around national identity. It's at variance from English Canada, but it's certainly shared. Saskatchewan's growth plans are these kind of, I think, kind of remarkable center-right government with 10-year economic strategies. They're not central planning by any case, but they're serious economic-wide thinking. So I think something is possible at the provincial level if we bring the provinces together as equal interlocutors with the federal government. Do you have a sense that it would be convergence that we see? It'd be creative disagreement. Like, how would those first ministers' meetings look in your imagination to get us to a coherent, say, shared sense of direction and, as you say, questions?
Yeah, so one point I do make in the book. So this is a short book I wrote, incidentally, while I was up in Ottawa as a visiting scholar at the Canada School for Public Service. So, and one of the things I do say in this preface, which is full of excuses for the rest of the book, is I don't look at provincial capacities as well, which, as you quite rightly point out, is critically important too. What's the sort of tenor and character of governance at the provincial level? I don't have I don't expect that if we were to reinstate the practice of regular and robust annual First Ministers conferences, that we're going to reach some sort of nirvana where we're all on the same page about national priorities. There are deep disagreements among provinces about what national priorities should be, or even about the extent to which we ought to be talking about them collectively. But the argument I think I would make is that that level of sort of, the fact that there isn't underlying consensus, a sort of natural consensus, is exactly the reason you have to have these meetings. You have to do it for two reasons, because you have to try as hard as you can to at least establish a common understanding of what the challenges are. And you have to demonstrate to the rest, and you aspire so far as you can to shape a common agenda, and you need to also to demonstrate to the public. You need to anchor for the public and say, this is the sort of stuff we're talking about. So everyone else gets on the same page. This is the general challenge of stabilizing the agenda of the public conversation, and also to demonstrate to the public at large that people who disagree with one another can talk civilly about their differences. We lament the decline of civil discourse in Canada, but what kind of message does it send when the Prime Minister and Premier say, what's the point of an annual meeting? We'll just shout at each other. So there's sort of a discontinuity there. The analogy I think I would draw is actually with the experience of the European Union. When the European Union got going in one of its previous incarnations, heads of government did not routinely get together. The notion was that the European Commission and individual ministers would sort of get together to sort out issues of the moment. The councils of ministers, in particular portfolios. And to some degree, that's what we're doing, with regard to intergovernmental diplomacy right now. And then at a certain point, people said, there's no capacity for strategic direction here for the system as a whole. And that was the emergence of the European Council, the heads of government getting together, at first informally, and surely the diversity in the Canadian system isn't as big as the diversity in the European Union, but there's a routine. There's a negotiated agenda. There is a certain period of conversation. There are communiques afterward. There's no expectation that there's going to be a deal every time they meet, but there's a conversation about what, there's an elaboration of what the conversation is. And that helps everybody else in the system too, because they know, okay, if you're an NGO, if you're uh, some civil society organization or an industry group, you know what the conversation's about. It's anchoring. It kind of helps everybody else steer to know what they're supposed to talk about.
Brian asks an interesting question here, and I think you touched it a little bit early in the presentation when you talked about, realizing that we're subject to history and states can fall. But yes, what does the sense of having a grand story of being safe play in this? Canadians feel safe, other nations don't. Can we have strategy if we always feel safe?
If you're feeling safe, you're not paying attention, I guess would be my first line. And I would argue that wasn't meant as a personal critique. That's the universal you. Um, the uh, um, I actually would argue that one of the first steps toward adaptability is a political culture that recognizes the fragility of political order. It's not great to have to wake up in the morning and think, okay, I need to worry about the robustness of the system and its resilience, but at least it sets your mind in a particular direction, right? If you're conscious of the fragility of the system, you're vigilant about risks. You're thinking about where the dangers lie. You're investing in the capacity necessary to um, gauge what those hazards really are. And in the capacity to think creatively about how we're going to address them. So I think a critical first step is this sort of appreciation of the fragility of the system and the complexity and turbulence of the environment. And actually, I think if you look at the sort of political culture of Canada in the 20th century, it was there, right? From leaders from Laurier through to Chrétien, basically saying, if we don't manage this thing properly, it'll fall apart. And incidentally, I mean, we haven't talked about American politics yet, but I think one of the things that has to happen in the United States too is this appreciation that if we don't start managing things more adroitly, things will fall apart. You can't run around banging the other half of the population, relentlessly and expect that it's going to turn out well.
I'm going to try to edge it. There's a question here from Peter that I am going to try and edge a little bit into American politics. He wonders how we deal with what he calls irrational influences, like people's mindsets around race or gender as it pertains to leadership and who owns a seat at the table or not. It seems to me Canada's changed a great deal on some of those vectors and less so on others over the last generation. And there's probably some rethinking about the how necessary. I do think the US is an example of a place where those kind of identity issues are going in really unexpected ways. It's not a big feature of the book, but I wondered how you would think about kind of incorporating those factors into your analysis.
I think off the top, I would say, my pet hypothesis about American politics, incidentally, is that what's at play here is sort of a unacknowledged sectionalism, or what we might call regionalism, that isn't being managed particularly well. I can come back to that later on. And I think, but I do take the point that, this is a challenge. We're in a very unusual place. I mean, two things have happened. At least two things have happened over the last 60 years. We have made democracy more robust. A system of government in which everybody is at least formally fully enfranchised is relatively new. Really, it's 2 generations old. Formal universal adult enfranchisement is relatively new. And then, of course, we've empowered people through the expansion of rights and through technological change. So we've created this, and and this is all unprecedented. No one's ever been here before. And then the challenge is, how do you manage a public conversation that is respectful of difference, um, but also, is productive? And I don't have a neat answer to that, except to make the observation that it's something that requires deliberate thought. And let me just walk back and repeat a point I said earlier on. 100 years ago, nobody took the existence of a Canadian public sphere for granted. In fact, they wondered whether it did exist. The sort of notion was, are we just sort of mimicking what we see our betters in London and Washington and New York doing? Um, and the notion was, okay, we're going to have to make deliberate efforts here to foster a public conversation. It's going to require interventions by civil society, but also by governments. Then radio came along, and we thought, okay, we've got to step back. This has sort of upended what we were doing. Let's pause, and I think it was the Aird Commission that did that. Then television came along, and then we had the Massey Commission sort of thinking about that. And then, cable came along, and we had the upending of newspapers and the Kent Commission. So we've got a tradition in Canada that we should sort of acknowledge, of basically saying, okay, let's take a pause. The world changed in unexpected ways. What do we need to do in order to make sure we've got the healthy public sphere? And this question is sort of in that line. What are we doing to take a pause and address this question deliberately and systematically, rather than just sort of, being on the back foot as technology upends the way we talk to one another?
Um, Jump ahead a little bit here because Nea asks a great public admin question, and we haven't had one of those yet. So she the question is, what's your perspective on accountability in the Canadian public service? If there are too many rules affecting performance, how do we fare vis-a-vis other G7 countries on accountability, and how could we think about improving where we are?
I always, I mean, accountability, let's say in the abstract, is a good thing. I'm not quite sure how to pursue the question, because I don't know. It would have to be accountability to whom, for what, and I don't quite know how to address the question more directly.
Let's I think so. If I were to put my riff on it, I would say, like, I think there is the argument around kind of the profusion of rules, but I think I would argue there's a diversification of types of accountability. So you have the conventional Westminster up to the elected type. There's the various forms of stakeholder consultation. There's the growth of rights that you talk about in the book. There's unelected officers of parliament. There's this kind of scattered and weakened free press. And as public servants become more public facing, all of those things becomes forms of accountability they need to balance. And I
Yeah.
would that would be how do we think carefully through that? Because the old stories we tell about the kind of private public service and Sir Humphrey clearly no longer match the lived reality of public servants.
Well, that's right. And I think, an exposition of the lived reality, I think, would be timely and very useful. We've got all kinds of accountabilities. Every time we create a new system of rules and new watchdogs, we're elaborating accountabilities. What we haven't tallied are the tangible and intangible costs of the increasingly elaborate control regime. Tangible. How much do we actually spend on compliance? How much does the bureaucracy spend on compliance with various kinds of um, control requirements today? That's the sort of tangible. And then what's the intangible effect on performance or distraction, or the getting the job done? Um, and sometimes there's a sort of conversation about, like, zero tolerance of error, and that's just not going to happen. We need to have a frank conversation about where the the benefit cost analysis about the imposition of rules has just gone awry. Um, so that's the sort of thing I worry about. And again, just to kind of repeat a theme, this is a place that no one's been before. Um, as I said, democracies of our type are relatively new structures. And what we're looking at is the evolution of a bureaucracy within this sort of emerging form of democratic governance. And and I'm sure other governments are going through this too. And the question is, what happens to bureaucracy as democracies evolve? And do they sort of develop their own kinds of pathologies, excessive control? Um, you know, um, I'm not sure this example works, but I'll throw it out there. ArriveCan, the ArriveCan app, which which clearly had its difficulties in execution, and I don't mean by phrasing it that way to understate them. Um, how much money and time have we spent doing a retrospective analysis of the ArriveCan exercise? Be curious to know that. But the other thing I'm wondering about is, I mean, how long have we been talking about ArriveCan now? 2 years, 3 years? Did ArriveCan work? Is there any analysis publicly accessible about what ArriveCan was supposed to do and whether it actually performed the function? Um, in all our deliberations about ArriveCan, does anyone sort of put their mind to asking whether it saved Canadian lives? How many lives did it save? I mean, this, I suppose, goes to the general question of, did we do any retrospective analysis of how we managed, adequate analysis of how we managed the pandemic? But there is something going on here about an excessive preoccupation about certain kinds of behavior. When we obsess about rule violations with regard to procedure, but don't even ask basic questions about the good that might have been produced by a program.
There's a follow-on question that I like because it's quite specific, and it's something I see our students struggle with when they transition into the public service. And that is one of the other accountabilities that people take on is privacy, right? That the notion that your advice and your personal views somehow become, if not fully private, quite a bit more restricted. That's very different from a culture of, LinkedIn thought leadership and essays on Facebook and Substack.
Yeah, and Reddit. Don't forget Reddit.
Can't forget Reddit. I think that is a really practical problem for kind of the rising generation of public servants. It's a not a shift, but it plays into that public sphere you like to see preserved and enhanced. And there's a lot of technological change in there too. Would that be one of the other types of things you'd suggest having shifted or looked at?
Well, and let's throw in, yes, and let's throw in there too, remote work, an area where we're essentially inventing policy on the fly. And how is that going to shape? How do we think about the performance question? My sense is that we're doing improv. It strikes me this is an area where doing some sort of standalone analysis of how things are going as things proceed would be very, very useful. And one of the questions is going to be, how do we think about performance? I get the impression that when we think about performance in remote work, we're focusing very heavily on transactions. Does the day-to-day get done? But we're not thinking about longer term institutional questions about how that, affects the evolution of organizational culture, the transmission of values, or so on. So, these are other sort of big questions I think it would be useful to look at.
And I'm kind of shocked. Nobody in the chat has asked, so I will. Our major trading and security partner has gone through a thing. It is a foreseeable thing. But what would a grand strategy of the American relationship look like over the next 4 years for Canada?
Of the relationship with the United States?
Yeah.
Um, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I think, I said at the top that one of the challenges for Canada is going to be political instability in major players over coming decades. And I was thinking specifically of the US, India, China, and the European Union, that all of them are going to be dealing with what the Chinese call stability maintenance. And the US is too. It doesn't matter who would have won that. This would have been true regardless of who won the election last night. The problem of internal cohesion and instability in the US is going to persist for many years. So one reality is that Canadian policy is sort of going to have to reflect that, accommodate the reality that we've got an uncertain partner who's going to be skittish in behavior. Um, there's obviously going to be specific knock-on effects in areas like immigration, trade, immigration, and so on that have to be addressed, and building sort of risk management in those particular domains. What if our partner changes their mind is going to have to be key. And there's also going to be knock-on effects in terms of political culture and political dynamics, precisely because the Canadian and American spheres have fused, public spheres have fused. That's the wrong word to use. Partly because the Canadian public sphere has to some degree become an adjunct of the American public sphere. I think we should expect that there's going to be kind of an overflow effect in terms of the way Canadians think and talk about politics just because of events in the US.
I'm also kind of curious, as I mentioned off the top, I know you've been doing talks on this book right across Canada, some a little bit internationally. I'm 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 wondering if you're seeing different concerns or different questions pop up as you speak to different audiences. Like, is there a, I think you're right to say, have I captured the problem right? Is there regional differences or urban rural differences in what the problem is, or are you getting put on the same hot seat over and over again?
I haven't particularly noticed regional differences. I think part of the difficulty might be people are being very polite, you know. So I do think that there is a concern that some of what I'm saying has a certain retro vibe. Why don't we do things the way they did in the 80s and everything would be fine? And that is not exactly what I'm saying. I do think, there's a virtue in looking at some of the practices of the late 20th century, refurbished and redesigned for a digital age. Um, and even if people don't like my specific prescriptions, I would, again, just go back to a point saying, if you want the system to hold together, if you want to counter centrifugal pressures or problems of miscoordination, um, if you want to avoid the problem of Canadian political discourse becoming a branch plant of American political discourse, especially in this era, what are we going to do about it? If we take seriously the notion that Canada is a distinct, coherent political enterprise, um, how do we execute that?
Very cool. Um, Scanning my chat here, because I do feel it's been rapid fire for you, but
Oh no,
we'll
no,
just
no
time up.
worries.
Um, maybe one last question. It's something in part because it's something I struggle to explain to students, and that is, you're asking the question about a kind of coherent stitching together of Canada as an entity. But I very often get very bright young people who are interested in government careers to cause change for the sake of climate or disadvantaged populations, or pick a policy area they're interested in that. And I think we can imagine a grand strategy to deal with homelessness or climate, or that's often how we think in those silos. I think you're asking about something broader, right? You're asking for something that brings those silos together into a coherent whole. I think that's often not how junior people think about their public service careers. They might grow into that over time. But I'm wondering if there's a piece in how we form public servants that would help them see that interconnectedness better earlier.
Yeah, so I'm going to make 2 points here. The and the second point is sort of going to go back to the strategies of governing book and also how we think about training people in public policy. So the people get jobs in specific areas, and they develop passions and interests in specific areas, and that's great. That's as it should be. And it's not one thing or another. It's not you're either thinking about policy domain X or you're thinking about sort of broad strategy. You do both. You on the day-to-day, you're focused in your policy area, but you also want to be sort of, every one of us as citizens needs to be asking sort of big questions about what do we imagine this enterprise is going to look like 30 years from now. What is this country going to look like? What are the challenges going to be? How is climate change going to shape the contours of this country and shape the geopolitical situation of this country over the next 25 years? What are the threats going to be? How is the advent of technology going to shape the economy? And this sounds very abstruse, but it ought to be able to tell it. We ought to be able to tell a story in plain language that's reasonably fact-based about how we think the world might look and the predicament we might be in. I mean, we can see some of the elements right now. I don't think it's a highly contestable proposition that the U.S. is going to remain in its current period of sort of instability for some time. We sort of know climate change is with us. So let's start telling a story about what the world's going to look like and how we're going to be in it. I should say that, one of the kind of elements of pushback is that, well, looking 25 or 30 years down the road sounds very, remote. But, as Canadians, we make 25 or 30-year decisions all the time. What kind of degree am I going to get? What kind of job or career do I want to have? Should I move from one city to the next? Should I start a family? Should I start a business? Should I buy a house? In our personal lives, we make these long run decisions all the time. And I'm just basically arguing we ought to apply the same logic in the political sphere. That with regard to, in the Strategies for Governing book, which was largely a critique of the way in which public administration, public policy is taught, especially in the United States, I basically say there's an excessive focus on what I call the micro or meso levels of governance. Meso level is basically how you run a specific agency, how you run a particular program. The micro level is like the frontline stuff of how individuals relate with one another, which is important, but there's also the macro level question of what is our conception about what the role of government should be and how is that changing? And because the point I would make is that there's always this ongoing conversation about what the overall kind of governing strategy looks like, and it shifts over time. When I was young, it was the shift from the sort of prevailing conventional wisdom of the 1970s, the Reagan insurgency, and then the sort of Clinton affirmation of the Reagan insurgency and the advent of neoliberalism. And now we're moving away from the neoliberal world and we're reconstructing in the US a new conception of what the role of government should be and what government will look like. And that's always going on. And the important point to make is that all these conversations we have about kind of the middle level questions about how should agencies be run, how should programs be run, how should we deal with citizens, they're always affected by the big conversation about what the role of government should be. You go back to the 1990s and look at, all of the discussion about reinventing government and making government work better and cost less, and citizens are customers and all that. That was connected to a bigger story about what government was supposed to be doing. And as we go through this transformation now, which is a shift to um, uh, away from globalism, away from neoliberalism to some degree, the resurgence of populism and nationalism, that sounds very abstract, but that's going to boil down to the question of how agencies get run, what agencies we have, how programs get run, who we count as citizens or stakeholders, and how we treat them.
Think maybe a call to carefully understand the state is an excellent place to end the afternoon, because it'd be a place to pick the conversation back up again. I agree with you. I think it's one that needs to be reassessed. We're 40 years into the old dispensation, and it's clearly not working anymore. So on that note, I'd really like to thank you for today. I hope everybody on the call has found something to think about and something to ponder. This is what passes for those of us at JSGS as a fun way to spend some time. So I hope you keep an eye out for future events from us. And I'd ask everybody to give a virtual round of applause for Alasdair as he goes about the rest of his day. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk. It was great having a conversation with you, and thanks to everybody for joining on a very busy day. I appreciate it.